Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Aleph Podcast. आज मेरे साथ हैं the one and only Babar Sheikh.
One and only. Wow.
I don't know any other Babar Sheikh.
That's true.
How are you?
I'm good, very good, and thank you, Umair, for inviting me over. It's always a pleasure to visit your lovely place, and it's there's a excellent feeling that I get whenever I walk in here.
I'm glad.
And I think Pakistan hopefully knows and will only know because हम लोग ज़रा लेट रियलाइज करते हैं चीज़ों में माशाल्लाह कि तुम इस तरह का अच्छा काम यहाँ पे कर रहे हो and this is great माशाल्लाह.
It's only the sum of what everyone
which is
comes
which is great,
becomes
which
part
is,
of it. You know?
No, which is great, which is how art, which is how music, which is how collective expression should be like, right?
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल. So I guess it's traditional for me to start this with everyone with like हर एक का एक different starting point होता है, inspiration point होता है. So what was it for you when you were growing up, when getting into creative industry?
For me, it was, I think it was art first of all.
Yeah.
So my father spent his youth and his college and school days in Calcutta, which made him very artistically inclined towards music. And हमारे यहाँ फ्राइडे की छुट्टी होती थी उस वक्त, तो सुबह अब्बा जो हैं वो मुख्तलिफ everything from qawwalis to like classical music to like some western ensembles, इस तरह की चीज़ें कैसेट रिकॉर्डर पे चल रही होती थी हमारे यहाँ. और and there was some art there. कराची में I am talking in the about the 80s and उसमें फिर my mamu, my mother's only brother, he is an artist. And it was really through him that I realized that this is what he had. A lovely studio at home, and he used to work as a commercial designer, artist, graphic designer. And he'd done his bachelor's degree in fine art in the 70s.
Right.
And he had a studio at home too. I really liked what he did. And only later on in life I realized, later on से मतलब कि school, college जब कर रहा था उसके दरमियान में मैंने फिर ये parents पे ये चीज़ explosion हुआ. उनको मैंने कहा कि I want to pursue a career in art and I want to get an education in it. And it was, it's tough for middle class parents like mine to kind of say okay fine, go ahead and do that, because अब तो बहुत change हो गया है यार scene. अब तो creative में लोग जाते हैं पढ़ते हैं. उस वक्त तो कोई, it was unheard of, and kudos to them. They let me pursue what I wanted to do. And तो ये simultaneous हो रहा था. At the same time जो है वो music का scene on हो गया था. Musically I had heard stuff like like stuff that everybody hears when you're growing up in the 80s, Michael Jackson and stuff like that. But obviously there was stuff that stuck out. Beat It का guitar solo मुझे बड़ा पसंद था, much before I realized कि Eddie Van Halen कौन है. And मुझे याद है फिर Dire Straits का एक गाना था Money for Nothing. उसके शुरू में that guitar part, I used to think that's probably the most. I used to think that is heavy metal, but this was like 7-year-old me, and 8-year-old मैं सुन रहा था ये चीजें. And then of course, I think this is the time when Appetite for Destruction came out in 89, 90. That blew me away. I was like, what is this stuff, man? And
it came out in 87, but I guess by the time people discovered it,
exactly. तो हम लोग जाके tapes लेते थे उस वक्त. And tapes हम लोग खरीदते थे जाके तारिक रोड पे. there was a few shops. डिफेंस में एक थी जिसका नाम Offbeat था. तारिक रोड में 3-4 थे. And they used to import vinyl and CDs. उस ज़माने में CDs आना शुरू हो गई थी, and they used to make copies of it on tapes for you, right? That would cost around 50-60 rupees at that time. तो वो होना शुरू हो गया था. Around that time जो है वो we moved into a new neighborhood, and there was 2 people over there who I think I owe them the most. One of them was working in an airline, and one of them was an electronic engineer.
Right.
last people on earth you would imagine to be metalheads, right? और you know उन्होंने मैं उनके साथ hang करता. I was much younger. I mean, they were older people. You know, they weren't my dad's age, but they were somewhere between my parents' age and mine. You know,
like
so exactly, right? तो वो उन्होंने मुझे कहा कि यार तुमने ये नहीं सुना, वो नहीं सुना. And then one day they took me, and since I later on discovered that, you know, I had to become a filmmaker, मुझे अब अंदाजा होता है कि वो पूरा माहौल था. मुझे याद है जुलाई अगस्त का महीना था, 90 की बात है, 91 की बात है. And बारिश हो रही थी, मानसून का चल रहा था, and you know, they asked me to come and listen to a record. Or the first song they played for me, and this system at that time I was 11 यार. तो 11 साल की उम्र में मुझे पता नहीं लगता था कि वो sound system पता नहीं कितना बड़ा था, and he'd actually made that, customized that sound system with different speakers, and he played the first song from the first Sabbath album, the Black Sabbath, right? And it's got a very cinematic, theatric thing to it, right? And then uske baad wo end mein the Ayomi part which goes you know, I was like, what is that, you know? So that was a defining moment. Uske baad there was no turning back, and then I got into like the Florida death metal scene. I heard bands like Obituary, Death, and all these really heavy bands, Venom, Bathory, all of this stuff that happened in the 80s. वो सब मैंने फिर backtrack किया, सब सुना. I got into extreme metal. So for me, pretty much to answer your question, I think it was art and music which kind of came together for me at the same time. तो वो मेरे लिए बड़ा interesting scene था कि वो साथ साथ हो रहा था. And around that time, then a few years later, I got into art school. तो वो मेरा, you know, DIY पहला डेमो जब रिकॉर्ड किया तो उसमें भी आर्टवर्क खुद बनाया हाथ से, you know, stuff like that. तो
वो किस प्रोजेक्ट के नाम से था?
Dusk.
Okay, Dusk. That was the first thing.
That was the first thing I ever did. Before Dusk, I used to play together with a friend of mine, Mustafa. Mustafa's now he's a surgeon. He's a cancer surgeon somewhere in the US, oncologist, right? And Mustafa was a gifted guitar player. He actually still plays in his hospital. All the doctors, the rocking doctors, have a band. I think they're called Bare Bones or something. So Mustafa abhi bhi baja raha hai. But we recently got back in touch. We've never been lost touch, but तो Mustafa और मैं हम बजाते थे. हमारा एक बैंड होता था Human Ash के नाम से. And we called Human Ash, and we used to play strange stuff, like it was कुछ blues, कुछ rock, कुछ metal parts होते थे उसमें. And उसके बाद I remember Mustafa के साथ मैंने कहा नहीं यार, I mean by that time I'd gotten into much heavier stuff, and I'd gotten him into heavier stuff. And I was like, yeah, let's play metal, and you know, and we got to play our own stuff. You know, screw the fact that we want to do covers. कोई सीन नहीं, अपना म्यूजिक बजाएंगे. Also I realized I was, by that time, early realization, 14 साल की उम्र थी, मुझे अंदाजा हुआ कि मैं बड़ा ही टेक्निकली कोई वीक आदमी हूँ. मुझे गाने तो मैं कॉपी नहीं कर सकता हूँ किसी का. मुझे की नहीं समझ आती, क्या अपना सब समझ आता. तो मुस्तफा के साथ वो किया. By that time he had kind of lost, because he was actually pursuing, and I was a pre-med student along with him, and at that time I said goodbye to pre-medicine. I had gotten into art. Mustafa went to become a doctor, तो उसकी पढ़ाई tough हो रही थी. तो उसमें फिर I kind of took things into my own. We were called, before Dusk, we were called Carcinogenic, and which was a more apt name in terms of being a straightforward brutal death metal sort of band. And we were inspired by Carcass, who were using a lot of medical terminologies in their music, right? तो हम लोग उस तरह की चीज कर रहे थे. लेकिन फिर मेरा ख्याल है Dusk just came to me. It was actually a song by a Swedish band, Entombed का एक गाना है Dusk, on one of their EPs, and I was like, that sounds like a good name for a band that plays heavy but also atmospheric. So what year was the first Dusk? This was 2 songs that I did, and this was in 1994. 93, me and Mustafa were writing these songs, and he never ended up recording them with me, and I ended up recording them somehow. And there's a very funny story to that, because this is before I knew anyone. मैं जो हूँ, उस वक्त I was a 14-year-old 13-14-year-old kid who was 14-15 का था मैं उसको 14 का था और मैं हैंग आउट करता था ये सारी आपकी हमारी जो म्यूजिकल फ्रैट सारी बैठती थी ना उस वक्त दे यूज्ड टू सिट इन तारिक रोड में एक जगह होती थी जिसका फराज ने भी शायद आपसे जिक्र किया हो जिसका नाम था फिश एंड चिप्स एंड फिश एंड चिप्स के ऊपर हम सब बैठते थे सब लोग ये एंड दे वर ओल्डर आई मीन इवन फराज एंड मी वी वर few years older than me so Faraz was the younger one out of that lot and there was अदनान आफाक अदनान वाई जिनको कहते हैं वो होते थे वहाँ पे तंसीर डार होते थे a lot of different people, right? And writers, poets, musicians, guitar players, singers, music promoters, people who went to become label bosses later on, they were all used to hang out there. और वहाँ पे मैं घूम रहा होता था और मैं कहता था, I was the only odd one out because I was into this extreme sort of stuff. उस वक्त था म्यूजिक फाइनल कट आया था बैंड रिजवान खान उनका शायद नाम है और उन्होंने फाइनल कट बैंड था विच वाज अ प्रोटो हार्ड रॉक बैंड ओवरड्राइव एक बैंड था उस वक्त ओवरड्राइव वाज अ बैंड विच वाज यू कुड कॉल देम मेटल बट दे वर मोर लाइक हार्ड रॉक बॉर्डरिंग ऑन हैवी मेटल दे रिकॉर्डेड सम रियली गुड स्टफ एंड उनका जो guitar player tha, I remember him being one of the only people who knew what I was talking about. He'd heard extreme metal and he'd like, I like Kerry King's lead playing. तो यहाँ पे ना ज़्यादातर जो virtuoso mentality is not the, I don't want mean to, तो उस वक्त भी ना मुझे लगता था कि थोड़ा सा mindset, mentality भी नहीं कहूँगा, mindset जो है हमारा मुझे उस वक्त फील होता है कि उस वक्त ही जा रहा था more towards the virtuosity and what later became I always say कि the prog scene sort of the American heavy prog sort of really took Pakistan's scene and all players wanted to be sounding like that right लेकिन उस टाइम पे the person फराज को भी मैं नहीं जानता था इतनी अच्छी तरह the person who actually took me under his wing and he said कि यार मुझे एक्सपीरियंस नहीं है इस म्यूजिक का मैंने सिर्फ द हेवीएस्ट मैंने सुना है मैंने डीप पर्पल सुना है बट यार मैं तुम्हें करके दूंगा दैट वाज इमू फ्रॉम फ्यूजन ही यूज्ड टू हैव अ लवली प्लेस जो कि पहले उसका शायद घर होता था फिर उसकी फैमिली हिज पेरेंट्स एंड हिज ब्रदर्स दे मूव्ड अ फ्यू बिल्डिंग्स अवे ये सारा कमर्शियल एरिया था तारिक रोड का ब्यूटीफुल टाइम बैक इन 94 एंड इमू का एक ग्राउंड फ्लोर पे घर होता था आई रिमेंबर अ जेंटलमैन sitting in the corner shredding away at that studio and that later I realized that was Shalim at that time he was a young guy तो मैं भी उस वक्त एज मेरी भी कम थी बहुत ही और इम्मू वाज आल्सो अ यंग गाय बट यार बड़ी बात है कि उसने मुझे कौन करता है यार इस तरह तो ही सेड कि यार मैंने उसको कहा मैं एक छोटा सा मेरे पास मार्शल होता था मिनिएचर मैं उस पर गिटार वो भी किसी का मांगा हुआ गिटार आई यूज्ड टू प्ले हिम इम्मू भाई इसको तो उसने कहा मैंने कहा इस पे डबल बेस ना तो ही यूज्ड टू वो कीबोर्ड पे ही प्रोग्राम्ड एवरीथिंग एंड इट साउंडेड really like programmed and but he did it for me that was great awesome. 4-track recorder था एक 4-track पे इमू ने वो डेमो मेरा रिकॉर्ड किया and we finished all the tracks बाउंस करना हमें आता नहीं था 4 ट्रैक्स हो गए थे तो उसके बाद मैंने फिर उसके वोकल्स ऐसे रिकॉर्ड किए थे कि डबल कैसेट प्लेयर था किसी के पास और एक कैसेट से दूसरे कैसेट पे रिकॉर्ड किया और वाइल रिकॉर्डिंग मैंने बगैर रिवर्ब के ग्राउल्स किए थे उसके ऊपर So it sounds like a really bad demo, but it was the first demo
That's
that you ever
cool.
did.
I mean, it's always really interesting to me if recording technology because एक तो available नहीं थी.
यार drive होनी चाहिए यार सारी बात सारी game drive.
So my first demos were like on mini disc.
Absolutely.
like उसके अंदर एक record का फंक्शन था और उसके थ्रू मैं लेयर्स बनाता था उसके ऊपर
तो मतलब वही वाला सीन है उसके बाद फिर फराज बिकॉज फराज इज स्टूडेंट देन वी स्टार्टेड जैमिंग टुगेदर मी एंड हिम एंड देयर वाज अ ड्रमर who I had befriended during this time.
Faraz was already teaching back then.
Faraz was teaching back then. Faraz was Faraz at that time also.
He was Faraz.
Faraz was Faraz at that time, and then he was recording his first album.
Yeah.
The music producer Amir Hassan, जो कि आज भी मेरे बहुत अच्छे दोस्त हैं, Amir bhai was here. Amir Hassan was encouraging a lot of these underground artists to come forward. But obviously Dusk was way too heavy for him.
Yeah.
But he was encouraging Overdrive. He was recording Faraz's album. He was recording a lot of other bands. He was saying कि आओ करो यार, label launch करेंगे, खुद ही release करेंगे. Because EMI by that time had started to, I mean, there was all sorts of horror stories. Already horror stories
back
थी.
in the 90s.
Because अब ये बहुत सारी muddled information इसलिए because मैं खुद तुम मुझसे पूछ रहे हो तो all of this old stuff is coming out. During this time, another person who'd actually helped me, because मुझे तो 1-2 chords आती थी. Me and Mustafa once ऐसे ही हमें पता था हमारे एरिया में एक साहब रहते हैं जिनके लंबे लंबे बाल हैं और यार वो लाजमी किसी बैंड में बजाते होंगे. एट दैट टाइम इन द अर्ली 90s आपने अगर बाल लंबे रखे हुए, जीन्स पहनी हुई है, तो आप लाजमी क्रिएटिव आर्ट्स या म्यूजिक से आपका ताल्लुक है या फिल्म मेकर होंगे आप.
Till very recently.
तो हम लोग जो है वो एक दिन ऐसी घर पे पहुंच गए. उस घर पे पहुंच गए and we rang the bell and we knew the person's name. That person was Ali Tim from the Milestones. And Ali Tim came out and he was very nice, and and I think the following week we went again to his house. हम लोग पढ़ाई कर रहे होते थे, फिर हम उठ के चले आते थे. तो उसने कहा यार अंदर आ जाओ. We went inside. He used to live in like this room जहाँ पे दीवार का 1 इंच नहीं नजर आ रहा होता था. हर जगह पोस्टर ही पोस्टर, and records and LPs and like wow, Yeah. He was the guy who actually taught me how to play the first rock and roll riff. उसने कहा यार ये तो म्यूजिक जो तुम सुन रहे हो ये पावर कॉर्ड्स होती हैं. पावर कॉर्ड्स मुझे बताएं कि 5th पकड़ता है. ये सारा अली टिम ने किया मेरे साथ. And later Ziad Gulzar as well really helped me. He gave me effect pedals, which he wasn't using. He said take them यार, कौन करता है ऐसा यार. These were huge personalities on my end. They had a big impact on me यार. तो during that time फिर फराज का student जो है वो एक सुहेल, and Suhail now lives in somewhere in the Middle East. He works in aviation. He didn't pursue a musical career later on. But Suhail and me used to jam, and there was a drummer who had never sat on a drum kit. Never.
But you just have to have the drummer mindset.
यार हम लोग पता क्या करते थे, वो अपने घर पे उसके घर में जो कुशन होते हैं, अब तो काउचेस आ गए ना, पहले कुशन्स होते थे जिप वाले कवर जिसका होता था, उसमें हम लोग डिफरेंट मोटाई के अखबार डाल के, तो he used to play on cushions, अब ड्रम स्टिक्स थी उसके पास, and we used to jam all these tunes, and he used to just be playing on those things. So मैं, Suhail and that drummer Roger, who was a through and through rocker at that time. मेरे भी लंबे बाल नहीं थे, Roger के लंबे बाल थे. And Roger was also, he was Anglo-Christian, right? So he also did not look like he was Pakistani with his hulia. And he used to be wearing flannel and like metal t-shirts and like, ripped jeans. Back in 93, man, crazy stuff. तो वो बड़ा सीन था. तो हमने फिर साथ में जैम शैम हम करते थे. उसके बाद at that point then Faraz helped us, because when it came for time for recording, we could not, for proper recording, the first time we went into a studio, Dusk went into a studio, it was not possible to record drums, because until very recently कोई भी नहीं रिकॉर्ड करता था ड्रम्स. तो उसमें फिर फराज के पास गए. फराज ने कुछ ड्रम्स प्रोग्राम किए which sounded less programmed. And
so what studio was that?
That was a studio called Soundmaster. Soundmaster studio सदर में होता था, and it was the place to go. उस वक्त EMI का स्टूडियो होता था, जो कि हमें माइलस्टोन से बड़ी हॉरर स्टोरी सुनी थी हमने कि यार अगर आपका गिटार ट्यून नहीं हो तो इंजीनियर आपको बाहर फेंक देगा भाई, इस तरह की बातें. और अगर आप की में नहीं गाए तो ये हो जाएगा, वो हो जाएगा. हुआ ये कि माइलस्टोन्स at that time, Milestones finished. They went on to a hiatus or finished. Ali Haider, Ziad, Alan Smith, and Ali Tim decided to form a band called Akash. जिनके गाने अभी भी YouTube पे आप देख सकते हैं. Ziad said, "Yeah, I really wanted this image of the band," and at that time I started working as a graphic designer while before going to Indus Valley. मैं freelance काम करता था लोगों के लिए, लोगो बना दिया, ये कर दिया. तो Ziad said कि यार आप कुछ बनाओ तुम मेरे लिए. तो मैंने बनाया. The record company said, यार हम आपको कंप्यूटर पे फोटोशॉप पे लोगो बना. ज़्यादा नहीं करनी है, मुझे ये चाहिए, ये हैंड ड्रॉन लोगो चाहिए. तो उन्होंने कहा ठीक है. मैंने ज़्यादा को कहा, मैंने कहा यार मुझे 4,000 रुपये होते हैं लोगो डिज़ाइन के, जो प्रॉपर फी होती है. तो ज़ियाद ने या अली ने मुझे कहा कि यार द लेबल इज सेइंग they'll give you a studio shift instead of paying you. You know, I said, yes. So we had one night, और वो भी they gave us the graveyard shift, the night shift. रात को हम पहुंचे 7:30 बजे हम पहुंचे हैं रात को. उन्होंने कहा भाई एक रात है, जो करना है मिक्स रिकॉर्ड सब इसमें होगा. But we recorded on spool यार. You know, so that's
fun.
That was recorded on spool and it sounded so warm, so beautiful. I remember सुबह का वक्त था, बिल्कुल रात को 4 बज गए थे जब तक हमने ट्रैकिंग खत्म की, अपनी रिदम शिदम की, लीड्स की. उस वक्त रात को 4 बज रहे थे when I went into the vocal booth. And the guy, I still remember the guy's expression.
When you started
when I started, I almost went into a ritual. I sat, मैं mic के सामने खड़ा हुआ, I did my warm up, I was like, and then I started that whole growling, the first time I did, तो वो मुझे याद है, he wanted to throw us out. He thought that there's something wrong with this guy, But it's good fun times, we actually, it's good memories, I suppose,
Yeah. I mean, I remember being in like probably 9th, 10th grade, around 99.
You went to school here in Karachi?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I was at grammar.
Oh, okay.
And because in the year 2000 I left to be in Nairobi for a couple of years. But before that, क्या कहते हैं, I remember before that, around that time I saw Faraz Anwar and Babar Sheikh, Dusk posters around. Like if I went to like Khadda Market, I used
that was 2001 almost, because So हुआ ये कि Sohail gradually moved out of the picture because Sohail was getting more and more. और जो सबके घरों में यही मसला होता था, मेरे घर में भी था कि यार ये म्यूजिक में तुम खराब हो जाओगे. फराज had said goodbye to education, right? तो फराज ने कहा यार मैंने तो नहीं पढ़ना है, ये मेरा पाथ है. बट मेरा ये नहीं था सीन, एंड आज तक नहीं है. एंड आई हैव ऑलवेज बीन sort of, music has always been like a glorified hobby. It's more than a hobby for me, but it hasn't been my profession ever.
Well, you've kept yourself free of the pressure of having to earn from it.
Exactly, right? So I was very lucky. I feel very blessed that I could have done that. But वही ज़्यादातर दोस्त हमारे इसीलिए कि वो फैमिली का प्रेशर के जी म्यूजिक में कुछ भी नहीं है, ये नहीं है, वो नहीं है, तो ये नहीं हो सकता. तो ज़्यादातर लोग इस तरह हो जाते थे. तो फिर फराज एंड मी कंटिन्यूड. आई हैड गॉटन मोर एंड मोर. We'd become friends and we had common interests and we used to watch the same films. And Faraz's room at that point was like also this crazy place where, friends of ours hang out हो रहा होता था. रात को हमने कोई ना कोई फिल्म, obscure फिल्म, आपने कोई यूरोपियन फिल्म लगा ली, वो देख रहे हैं आप. फिर आधी रात को Faraz would sit and start jamming to like some backing track. तो वो वाली चीजें होती थी. बड़ा हमने it was a good time. That was the first, around the same time was the first incarnation of the first Mizraab.
Right.
That was before they turned rock and hard rock or metal or whatever you want to call them. That was for me a beautiful time in my life. Because Mizraab के गाने रिकॉर्ड वो कंपोज हो रहे होते थे. अख्तर कयूम used to be there. खालिद खान बेस बजाता था, और अख्तर भाई percussion, and he wrote all the beautiful lyrics to those. All these songs are written by him. Panchi, Mayusi, all the lyrics are by Akhtar Qayyum. Good friend of good friend of ours. And मेरे तो बड़े अजीज हैं आज भी अख्तर भाई. And
he was a percussionist.
Akhtar Bhai actually was a percussionist, and Akhtar Bhai used to play in several bands, and he used to play on radio and on recordings. He's played with Nisar Bazmi Saab. He's played with Alamgir Saab. He's played with all the legends. Back in the day, radio पे भी बजाया. Sohail Rana साहब के साथ orchestra में बजाते थे वो. तो and then Akhtar Bhai ने बहुत काम किया. Akhtar Bhai is a man of many talents. One of the first feature-length films that unfortunately never got made, that I started going to producers के यार इसको बनाते हैं. That was written by Akhtar Bhai.
अच्छा.
So he's also written a few films and he's a writer as well. तो वो बड़े ज़बरदस्त आदमी है. तो वो मिज़राब का पहला incarnation Akhtar Bhai के साथ था. I remember मैंने तस्वीरें खींची थी जाके हिल पार्क के ऊपर. हमने फराज एंड इरफान खालिद एंड उसके बाद फिर वो that album came out. And that is nothing like what you hear the later Mizraab.
Right. So what would you describe that early Mizraab,
man.
you know, as a
Beautiful stuff. Mahavishnu Orchestra.
more progressive rock?
यार it was more rock कम था.
हाँ.
Acoustic पे बहुत काम हुआ था. और delay guitars थे.
हाँ.
It was much more atmospheric. It had a couple of really thriving rock songs.
Yeah.
There was a song called Ishq on it.
Yeah.
And Faraz also was really without any inhibition, really letting go of himself and screaming और falsetto में गाया था उसने पता नहीं क्या क्या किया था. तो वो बड़ा एक टाइम था यार. और
So like I'm jumping around a bit, but like you mentioned Dusk का नाम, you know, that appealed to you because it had the darkness
And
suggesting
the
the atmosphere. So you were into atmospheric stuff
heavily
also.
all the way.
So what was the atmospheric kind of inspiration?
यार atmospheric inspiration I guess metal में तो इतनी कुछ शुरू में इसी तरह की चीजें
काफी dry
था. वही काफी वो grinding किस्म का था. But I think things changed when I heard a lot of European metal. Even the black metal bands from Norway.
Yeah.
You know, they had this atmosphere thing going on because they used to crank up their reverb. वो एक उस तरह की चीज़ें रहती थी. फिर आहिस्ता आहिस्ता साउंड इफेक्ट्स आना शुरू हुए. बीच में बारिश की आवाज़, इसकी चीज़ें, ये वो सारी. तो वो चीज़ें भी आई. और उसके बाद then I got into a different type of prog. I got into more avant-garde metal from Europe around 98, 99. You know, bade bands.
But it seems like that also had something to do with. I mean, this is before digital technology took over, right?
Yes, for
and
sure.
Things became easier and cheaper.
For sure.
So I feel like it also had something to do with how expensive it was to get a polished sound.
Exactly. Yeah.
Plus, you needed to be polished players. You know, editing itnly zyada nahi hoti. So if you were just below that, then we were like, "Acha, let's add all these other elements to make it interesting."
You can absolutely. That could be one way to derive it for sure. Because हम लोगों ने जब पहली एल्बम की थी, I was also really not into. I was by that time bored with being called an extreme metal band.
Yeah.
मुझे लगता था कि यार सब कुछ करें. फराज ने मुझे एक गाना था हमारा जिसके आखिर में फराज was just picking chords, like, you know, doing like, and at one point उसने he started like doing almost like this funk pop type picking. And he said नहीं cut करो यार. We were recording on ADAT. He said cut करो यार, ये तो बहुत अजीब सा. मैं कहा नहीं यार, keep it. You know, वो आखिर में जाके वो it becomes that kind of funk pop picking. You're playing on a metal album. तो हम लोगों ने पहली album 99 में जो आई थी हमारी, My Infinite Nature Alone, first record that came out, it was released by a Portuguese record label, and it was a dream come true. I mean,
how did you reach out to these labels?
So from all the way from my first demo recording, the DIY demo, उसके बाद जितनी भी चीजें हमने टेप पे करते रहे, I got into the international underground circuit.
Right.
और हम लिखते थे खत लिख के आप साथ में $2 स्टैंडर्ड फी होती थी. उस वक्त डॉलर मेरा ख्याल 40 रुपए का, 50 रुपए का होता था.
35 भी था.
तो वो हम जो है वो $2 आपको किसी के भी टेप चाहिए हो तो या तो आप अपनी टेप भेज दें और या आप $2 कंसील करके लेटर के बीच में डाल के भेज देते थे. वो आपको अपनी टेप भेजते थे. तो आई यूज्ड टू बी इन पार्ट. आई वाज टेप ट्रेडिंग विद पीपल फ्रॉम Sao Paulo. I was tape trading with people from Estonia, Finland, Mexico. I mean, all parts of the world. Philippines, Singapore. Singapore was one of my safe havens because early Singaporean extreme metal scene has got a lot to do with my cultivation as a metalhead, because there was a person who's a Singaporean person, but his father had roots in Pakistan and he lived in Pakistan in the 90s, and he and me started writing letters to each other. And then I went and visited him. It was easy for me to travel at that point. तो मैं बहुत छोटा था और मैं उसके पास गया and I saw this life and I was like, wow, this is great, and actually went to some metal gigs and stuff. So वो मेरे ऊपर बड़ा एक वो था. So that's how.
It's a big part of the metal culture is this community.
Community का scene है यार. और once a metalhead, always a metalhead. You know, you get into so many other genres. You know, I was probably not listening to metal in my car right now when I came to your place. But that does not take away the metal from inside of me, right? Neither does, because that is one of the points that you and me also connect on, right? तो एक वो होता है, no, don't mean to sound gender biased, लेकिन एक वो brotherhood वाली चीज है यहाँ पे metal. So this record label from Europe reached out and they said, we want to release your first album, and we said, wow. And it happened. And उस वक्त मतलब है metal, मेरे पास आज तक पड़ी हुई है copies of Metal Hammer from those times, जिसमें हमारी album का advert है.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
And at that time also, I was really seriously had gotten friends with people who I realized कि, you know, these are the oddballs, you know. तो मैंने अपना वो बना लिया था. By 97, 98 I was regularly writing letters to and forth. Reply भी आता था to Michael Arkenfeld from Opeth, right? So
oh really?
I still have those letters.
I need to see that.
Sure,
He's
man.
one of my heroes.
Sure. तो Michael Arkenfeld, this is the time जब उनकी सिर्फ first album आई थी, and I'd heard them on a compilation on this Candlelight Records compilation. एक गाना था उसमें, शायद मेरा ख्याल है Advent था.
I'm getting goosebumps listening.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
2003 I finally met him. And I went to a Porcupine Tree and Opeth show. They were doing the support tour for the Damnation album. And
favorite album.
Yeah. So I went to a show in Detroit, really small show. And I was actually, Mustafa was with me, and Mustafa by this time, after so many years, we'd connected in America. And I said, man, there's this band called Opeth, and he's like, wow. And मैंने कहा यार उससे मैं एक ज़माने में मेरी अब तो 4 साल हो गए, we haven't written to each other, but you know, I would love to go and see the show. And we went, and after the show, outside the bus, you know, there was a few people standing around him. At that point, Opeth also had not exploded like they are now. And कुछ लोग थे, autograph हो रहे थे. तो I just walked up. मैंने कहा, Michael, this is Babar. He's like, oh man, finally I get to meet you. And you know, वो तस्वीरें हमने खिंचाई और वो हैं पड़ी भी कहीं ना कहीं. उस ज़माने में Peter Lindbergh भी होता था, guitarist, one of my favorite all time. Lindgren, not Lindbergh. तो वो भी बड़ा एक सीन था. तो ये हाँ भाई, ये like उस Opeth की तरह के bands मैंने identify करना शुरू कर दिए थे in the 90s also, कि ये लोग कुछ oddballs हैं. अलग scene है. Cathedral was one of my favorite bands. Lee Dorian, who was actually singing for Napalm Death, went to form this really heavy sort of doom, you know, and I got more and more into the whole doom scene. मेरे लिए जो है वो fast speed was always thrilling to hear that. But for me, मेरा guitar hero हमेशा से Tony Iommi, कल उनकी सालगिरह थी by the way. तो वो हमेशा से मेरे guitar hero has always been Iommi. And so I've always been more grounded towards this sort of less wizardry and more sort of, you know, atmosphere and more heaviness and all of that stuff, you know.
And I mean, I met Michael Lagerfeld in 2006.
Wow.
I was living in London from 2003 onwards. Went to England for university and stuff. But 2006 में So my weekly like ritual was like going to Shaftesbury Avenue where there was Forbidden Planet, like you know, the geek store.
Yeah, of course.
And just down the street from there was this Denmark Street, which had all the guitar stores.
Yeah.
And so I had come out of Forbidden Planet. I had like this Batman graphic novel that I just got.
Nice.
And I'm crossing Denmark Street and I see Michael and Peter.
Okay.
And I'm like, Michael, and I shout Michael, and I think again, even in 2006, I don't think they were like superstars. You know, अब तो बहुत उनकी recognition है. But I recognized him and I called his name and he's like, yeah, and then you know, then he signed my graphic novel.
Oh wow, excellent.
But 2004 mein, and I don't know if anyone, I had this band called Void from 2003 onwards for a few years. And we did a couple of shows at Beria Women's Auditorium.
Yeah, that seemed to become the metal.
The ground zero.
Ground zero for metal later on. मैंने कितने bands के साथ वहाँ पे, you know.
मतलब वही 2002 से मैं Opeth सुन रहा था, Blackwater Park, then Damnation, and then they put out that live album with Damnation, Deliverance, and all.
Yeah.
So we played Closure.
Oh wow!
In our 2004 show, and I don't know if any Pakistani band covered Opeth.
I don't think so.
Before that.
I don't think so. Respect, man, for sure.
So, but yeah.
छोटी चीजें होती हैं बड़ी यार. I think उसके बाद कोई late 2000s में they came to Bombay. The first time they played in Mumbai, the promoter from there, who's a friend of mine. You know, he sends me an email later on. He's like, यार, I think email था या MySpace पे उसने मुझे मैसेज किया था. MySpace पे उसने कहा यार, अबे तुम किस किस्म के आदमी हो. यहाँ पे ड्रेसिंग रूम में माइकल आर्कनफेल्ड आके बैठा. उसके थोड़ी देर बाद उसने कहा तुम लोग पाकिस्तान में बाबर को जानते हो क्या. मैंने कहा कि यार ये क्या सीन है. मैंने कहा कुछ नहीं है यार. So he was trying to make conversation, you know. He's like neighboring. कहता भाई तू कितने लोगों को जानता है यार. मैंने कहा भाई मैं, you know. It's
but
just,
भाई it's honestly, Michael Arkenfeld is one of those similar to you, like, you know, collectors and
for sure, heavily
into the scene and finding bands and stuff like that.
So I've always been a firm believer of the fact कि आपको ना symbolically कुछ manifest होना चाहिए. आप किसी ना किसी तरीके से आपकी आइडेंटिटी होती है ना यार, और बड़ा जरूरी है. मेटल ने बड़ी चीजों से बचाया यार मुझे.
Like आप स्कूल में, like when I moved from Karachi to Nairobi.
Yeah.
अब कराची में ग्रामर स्कूल में everyone had to wear the uniform. बाल लंबे करो तो prefect पकड़ लेता था. नैरोबी में वो सीन नहीं था. It was an American school. You didn't have a uniform, and people could dress and do whatever they want. So you could identify what genre of music people listen to by how they dressed and the haircut that they had. You know, that was a scene.
That's it. Identity यार, अपनी एक identity. Throughout when I was at IVS, Indus Valley में जब मैं था, I used to dress in black from head to toe. You know, I used to have combat boots, गर्मी हो, सर्दी हो, बारिश हो, कुछ हो. Combat boots रोज पहनने. And you know, I think back in the day, अब तो खैर कभी कभार I paint my nails off and on, but you know, at that time every day religiously wear some like eye makeup and all of that. So it was an identity thing, right?
But let me jump to this because it was in my mind. And when I first saw the Dusk posters and all, I was a little scared. I was like, what is it? Because I was at that time into GNR.
It's about the image.
I hadn't got into the extreme side of things, and I was like, what is this? You know? So how were you perceived by people around when you were doing all this?
Horribly. I mean, it succeeded. It was successful. The plan was successful. लोग डरते थे. लोग कहते थे अजीब-अजीब बातें, because this is pre-internet, all that. So word of mouth बड़ा मजे का होता है ना, कि यार वो तो बड़ा अजीब आदमी है, and he's this and he's that, and you know.
I think even मैंने उस वक्त I never met you till much later.
Yeah.
But I had heard कि यार ये अपने gigs पे satanic rituals करता है और पता नहीं क्या. Like पता नहीं क्या.
कोई उसका दूर तक कोई ताल्लुक metal में है बड़ा इस तरह का scene about you know, being negative and negative forces, लेकिन हमारा कभी भी ऐसा scene नहीं था. And it was always like all good fun, you know. Yeah, the image, I went with the image for sure, because you know, I grew up seeing all these bands and like Tony Iommi as well, and you know, he'd always be into the image of things. So you know, I always went with like the stuff, and of course I used to look much different. I was much more heavier, so I carried the whole thing with like, you know. But I think यार, you know, honestly speaking, लोग पूछते हैं सवाल पाकिस्तान में कैसे सर्वाइव किया, यार सब कर सकते हैं यार, बड़ा जबरदस्त माहौल है.
I agree. मुझे लगता है कराची में जितनी फ्रीडम है, I mean as a male, let's say,
मसले होते हैं, हमेशा होते हैं, ऐसा नहीं है, but यार you know, I think it's been an experience. You know, honestly, it's been an experience. मैं जब यूनिवर्सिटी में था यार, बस में जाता था मैं. And I used to be dressed up very oddly at that time, you know. Or
I can imagine some looks.
But it was just looks, right? It was also part of that whole shock therapy. With rock and roll, it is all about shock therapy as well, right? So वो वाली lifestyle, मेरा ख्याल rebellion बड़ा ज़रूरी है. और ज़रूरी है रिबेल करके एहसास कर लेना कि किस चीज़ के अगेंस्ट रिबेल कर रहे थे और क्यों कर रहे थे आप, यू नो. तो एट वन पॉइंट जो है वो आप कहते हैं कि नहीं यार मैं नहीं करूँगा, नहीं भाई मेरा यही है हुलिया, सारी चीज़ें यही हैं, आपने एक्सेप्ट करना तो करें. वो पार्ट भी ज़रूरी है.
And actually the judgment makes you want to do even more. And more in the
we've all gone through that. And music has been a part of it. मुझे तो लगता है यार, लोग कहते हैं heavy metal music से लोग खराब होते हैं. मुझे तो heavy metal ने खराब होने से बचाया.
बिल्कुल.
From a lot of times when I was really, you know, going through, I mean, अब जाके उसका नाम हमारे पास है कि mental health issues. हर किसी के पास होते हैं यार. I've gone through tons of bad stuff in my life where I've felt pretty down in the dumps, pathetic, degraded, demotivated. Every time.
I mean, there's a band Karachi. उनकी identity ही ये है ना, to get people, it's like the music for depressed people.
Exactly, but
it gets you through depression. It gets you
through depression, right? It's क्या नाम लिया है, because मैंने Discouraged Ones जब सुनी थी पहली दफा, that was a very seminal moment in my life, man. And I was in Nepal backpacking back in 1999. और it was cold, man. मैं पता नहीं किस सीजन में नेपाल जाने का सोच लिया मैंने. And it was cold and it was, I was just, I had a Walkman. And Walkman पे मैं Discouraged One सुन रहा था. I do not recommend that to anyone. Do not listen to Discouraged One. It is probably, they put on some really amazing records, but Discouraged Ones, there can only be one of those albums.
I mean, I got into, again, 2006 May, I think it was released, The Great Cold Distance.
Yeah.
It changed my life.
Yeah.
Like, and then I went backwards and forwards.
नहीं बड़ा बहुत वो, and they're also very through and through solid sorted people यार. और बड़ा तो आपको ना आप अप्रिशिएट करते हैं. अब मैं अपने पुराने मेरे जो मेटल हेड्स हैं फ्रॉम द रीजन, बाय द वे, आई वाज आल्सो रियली थिक विद द रीजन. तो हमारे यहाँ रीजन मेरी चूंकि वो पेन फ्रेंडशिप और लेटर्स लिखना, तो नेपाल में the first death metal band like Dusk was one of the first ones that came out here. We're playing this sort of heavy extreme music. Nepal में the band that came out, the first band that came out, uska one of their guitar players, or rather bass player, they play two basses in that band. One of their bass players is a university professor. One of the other people who I was really good friends with in Singapore is also a PhD. He's got a doctorate. And he teaches, and so, you know, and they're all people who I know for like almost 30 years of my life, you know. मैं 13-14 साल का था जब मैं I got to know them, you know, and 25-30 साल हो गए हैं. वो लोग पता नहीं कौन कोई PhD डॉक्टर है, कोई क्या है, तो वो कर रहे हैं, लेकिन साथ वो चीजें चल रही हैं.
It always stays with you, right?
Absolutely.
So at what point did the turn towards doing something alongside like Chand Tara? How did that come about?
यार Chand Tara, मैं आपको honestly बताऊं, Chand Tara happened because of, I met, turning point in my life was 1997-98. उस वक्त तक बड़ा अच्छा लगता था ड्रीम थिएटर सुनना, ये सुनना वो सुनना. Nothing against Dream Theater, but I felt after a few albums they were doing the same thing again and again.
Yeah.
Or so ये मेरा personal opinion है.
I agree actually.
Faraz at that time had gotten into. I remember the first time I got him an Alan Holdsworth CD. मैं लंदन से या मैं सिंगापुर से उसके लिए पहली दफा लाया था टावर रिकॉर्ड से खरीद के एलन होल्सवर्थ की सीडी वार्डन क्लिफ टावर एंड दैट चेंज्ड हिज स्टाइल फ्रॉम श्रेडिंग लाइक मामस्टीन एंड वाई टू मोर legato playing, which is the Holdsworth style. And he was hardly even using his right hand, he used to just do hammer-ons, right? And you can hear a lot of that on the first Dusk album also. So by that time ना मुझे एक stagnation सी भी feel हो रही थी, metal scene में भी same चीज़ें हो रही थी metal में. Rizwanullah Khan and me became friends in 97-98. He had just come back after studying fine art and painting in Missouri, Kansas. He moved back to Pakistan. And at that time, you could really identify if you're an artist or a musician because हुलिये बहुत कम होते थे. By late 90s, मेरे भी बाल छाल लंबे थे. रिजवान मुझे किसी art gallery में मिल गए. Rizwanullah ne, and me and him connected on Sabbath because Rizwan's early influences were also Sabbath and Bill Ward and Ginger Baker and Cream and all of that stuff, right? So Rizwan got me into African music. Rizwan got me into world music. Rizwan got me into... I rediscovered folk music, folk Pakistani music through him. So Rizwan ने एक पूरा universe खोला. At the same time, Indus Valley में हमारा एक band बना, जो कि हमने एक दफा जुनून live बजा रहा था. And this is the heyday of Junoon.
Yeah, the absolute peak.
A peak late 90s, and I was a bona fide Junoon fan.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And मतलब है यार.
We all were at that point.
यार और क्या इसमें क्या बुरी बात है कहना, मुझे बड़ा अफसोस होता है तो यार पाकिस्तान यार थे नहीं थे पाकिस्तान में. उमैर मसला मैं आपको खुल के बताऊं, और मैं कोई अथॉरिटी नहीं हूं इस पे, लेकिन मेरी हम्बल ओपिनियन छोटा सा ये है कि हमारे यहाँ हम क्रेडिट नहीं देते यार लोगों को.
नहीं बिल्कुल सही.
हम क्रेडिट नहीं देते, हम रिकग्नाइज नहीं करते. यार जुनून नहीं होता, आपके पास सीन नहीं होता यार.
नहीं होता.
सलमान अहमद आज जैसा म्यूजिक बजाते हैं, लोग कहते हैं नहीं यार क्यों क्रिटिसाइज करते हैं. हम नॉन क्रिटिकल एनालिसिस क्यों नहीं कर सकते किसी चीज का. When that first album came out, when that nobody had played distortion like that, and the kind of fusion that happened. कल परसों तुमने पोस्ट किया हुआ था वो एक क्लिप यार.
That's such a
beautiful clip, right? And you listen to what they were doing with that riff on Bulea. I mean, it is so otherworldly.
When I heard Bulea for the first time, it just transported me.
Yeah, and you know, there was a dholak in the mix, and the drums were so...
beach.
Yeah, I mean, what beautiful...
and then Mitti Jo's album.
Sab kuch, everything that Junoon did. When they came out with Talash, for me it was Talash, because pehli album aayi thi to hum ud gaye the sare na sun ke, you know. And here's a guy who's not a guitar virtuoso. Salman Ahmad is more of a guitar player, musician, guitar player, composer than a virtuoso. But yeah, his solos, I remember his guitar solos. Yeah, it's like Jerry Cantrell. Yeah, exactly.
Not a virtuoso, but great songwriter.
Who says you have to be a virtuoso? वही वाली बात है. तो रिजवानुल्लाह मुझसे जब मिले ना, तो उस वक्त फिर हम लोग जुनून का एक शो था इंडस वैली में. हम इंडस वैली में पढ़ते थे, तो हमें कहा गया कि आपने अगर बजाना है तो me and a few other people, Ali Alam, myself, Ahmed Chagla, we used to play in a band together. And
this is Ganda
Banda, pre-Ganda Banda, नाम नहीं था उसमें. अदनान मदनी, जो कि अब एक डॉक्टर अदनान मदनी is a PhD in art philosophy, I believe. He used to sing with us. After that, हम लोग ने weekends पे shows बजाना शुरू किए at small cafes. They used to pay a small amount. We used to come and play covers. And at one point, I was hanging out with Rizwan a lot, and I said, why don't you join the band? And वो गंदा बंदा चला हमारा कुछ साल. I believe कि it was an early departure. We should have kept it going, but वो नहीं हो सका. But Rizwan के साथ जितनी मैंने obscure किस्म की अजीब musical चीजें की हैं. So before Tara Orchestra, me and Rizwan had a band called Aufgang. And Aufgang was, Rizwan came to me one day and he said that he'd met someone in a music store in Sadr who had a tenor sax. And this guy was into psychic healing. And this guy was into like the whole spiritual world and scene, okay? And Rizwan said, I've never met a person like this, okay? And he's not a guy who's like comes from a privileged, this person, when we met him, aisa nahi ki koi bahut hi koi privileged and, you know, suna hua records, but he'd heard jazz. And he was essentially what you call a free-form jazz player. Matlab hai, a lot like all these crazy saxophone players you hear, right? Miles Davis was in there in his playing, a lot of this crazy stuff. So me and Rizwan and this sax player, we went into the studio and we told the recording engineer to just press record. And we recorded for like the whole day. तो वो आज भी है मेरे पास, बड़ी अजीब एक्सपेरिमेंट्स किए. उसके बाद कुछ सालों बाद फिर चांद तारा, बहुत सालों बाद, me and Rizwan, we always wanted to do
something like that.
और बीच में एक ऐसा टाइम आया जब mid 90s में my room in my parents' house, my room had become this place where everyone used to hang out. Umran had just moved to Pakistan early. First time he was testing the waters. He was living at my place. Arib Azhar was living at my place. तो रात को जो है वो हम जमीन पे गद्दे, मैं, अरीब अजहर, एक दो और लोग, कमरे में चढ़ने की जगह नहीं होती थी. उमरान, हम सब रहते थे उस कमरे में और रोज जैम करते थे वहाँ पे. उस वक्त I wanted a style to collaborate on the folk influences, Pakistani folk, with a lot of the old Floyd. My favorite Floyd period is like Saucer Full of Secrets, Umaguma, all of that stuff. जब वो लोग 3 chords बजा रहे थे 2 घंटे के लिए.
Psychedelic, experimental.
Yeah, I believe you're obviously with Cosmic Fluid, you do a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, right? It's funny because I've never heard those albums.
Oh wow, really? Wow.
Like I can openly admit that, but somehow my music is going in that direction.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
तो मैं उस वक्त ग्लेन होता था यहाँ पे कराची में. ग्लेन जॉन used to sing with a band called Guru's Trilogy. And Glenn had finished Guru's and he said कि यार कुछ करते हैं अलग सा. वो हम लोगों ने तानपुरा, उसके पास रियाज करने के लिए तानपुरा होता था इलेक्ट्रॉनिक. अब तो YouTube पे मिल जाता है, बट ये 2008 की बात है. तो वो तानपुरा पे हमने माइक रखा शोर का FM 57 और हमने तानपुरा का ड्रोन चल रहा था डी में और हमने कहा यार इस पे बस जैम करो, बस
चलते.
तो बस फिर वहां से चांद तारा का सीन शुरू हुआ. ग्लेन अनफॉर्चुनेटली हैड टू लीव इन 2012. By that time we'd done interesting stuff यार. हमने लसन टीवी में अपीयरेंस की थी, इधर की थी, उधर की थी.
I heard this really crazy story from Jasir. I believe Lasan session में it was
Jasir was part of Chand Tara.
Part of it,
yeah.
Right? But the song Glenn was singing on that session is about his mother.
Is about his mother.
And his mother passed away.
Passed away. Passed away while we were recording.
That's unbelievable.
While we were recording. We called that song Margaret.
Yeah.
वो गाना जो है वो तो पुराना सूफियाना कलाम है. माए नीम मैं किन्नू आखा, मैं किसको कहूँ जाके. तो वो पुराना सूफियाना कलाम है, लेकिन उस गाने का नाम फिर आफ्टर ग्लेन्स मदर पास्ड अवे दैट सेम इवनिंग, मे गॉड ब्लेस हर सोल इंशाल्लाह, उनके नाम पे हमने फिर गाने का नाम मार्गरेट रखा था, होमेज टू हर. तो रिजवान भाई के साथ जो है, रिजवानुल्लाह मेरी ज़िंदगी का बहुत एक ज़बरदस्त हिस्सा है. अल्लाह उनको खुश रखे और ज़िंदगी दे. तो चांद तारा was with him throughout. और उसके बाद one day we were playing a show with Jasir and Aziz and me and Rizwan and Glenn was singing and Umran came to a show.
Yeah.
And Umran walked up to me after the show and he's like, I want in on this. I go, what do you mean? He's like, make me a part of the band now. And I was like, why? He's like, yeah, dude, I just want to do this stuff. I was like, okay.
That's awesome.
So during that time, Glenn also had to leave. He lives abroad in Sweden, Norway, I believe, somewhere in one of these Scandinavian countries.
Yeah.
He's not here anymore. तो उसके बाद फिर हमारी incarnation with Sherry started, and then it's never been about getting so many listens. हालांकि काफी लोगों ने सुन लिया है, लेकिन हमारा objective कभी ये नहीं रहा है यार.
I mean, I played with you guys.
You
played,
and it's
the Hootie show is memorable.
Amazing.
Yeah.
मेरा हमेशा से यही रहा है यार उमैर के मुझे लगता है कि it should be about a big ass collaboration, right? Which you do. You do all the time here. I mean, you have a great place where it's an open house.
Flow.
तो वो flow होना चाहिए.
और मुझे actually मैंने जो first track चांद तारा का सुना था वो खाक नशीन. उसमें जो मुझे इतनी feels आई वो आज भी आती हैं, you know.
And खाक नशीन was from the same tertiary वो because it starts with this keyboard का RPG keyboard का piece where tang 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 tang, you know, and the first time we jammed on that was मैंने उसको कहा कि यार keyboard Ali Khan was playing with us, मैं Ali Khan को कहा इसको loop पे लगा दे यार. And I actually have some of those beautiful recordings. I think वो पता नहीं है या नहीं है अभी तक, लेकिन वो थी बड़ी अच्छी recordings यार. और उसमें हम लोग जो है वो we used to just end up jamming for a while. Chantara ka second incarnation when Sherry joined at that time was Sikandar on drums. Sikandar then had to leave, and even before he left we did a lot of shows with Sikandar. Uske baad Gumby came into the band, and Khak Nashin was the first song that we recorded with Gumby. Gumby on drums. Ali Khan actually was playing keyboards, but Rizwanullah and myself and Sherry and Umran, and it is just 2 chords. You've played that song.
Yeah,
2 chords का गाना है वो.
It's a beautiful song to play.
But
yeah, and so I mean, there's so many things to talk about with you. I mean, you're also a filmmaker.
That's what I do.
An educator.
Yes.
So how does the 2 Babars coexist, or the 3 Babars, or do you feel it's all the same person, or are there different modes that you have?
कुछ आपको modes में जाना पड़ता है. Because आप जब इश्तिहारी दुनिया में advertising world में जब आप काम कर रहे होते हैं, that's a completely different ball game. It's a different mindset. It is about precision and it's about detail, right? And I do understand when a session player comes into the studio and wants to really nail it to the T, because that's what I do with the camera.
Right.
And that's what I do to someone's skin, or I want to perfect that emotion on camera. So वो बहुत detail का काम है. और उसके साथ मैं ज़रा सा अलग वो हूँ. But हुआ ये है कि over the years, then Dusk and Chand Tara and all these things have been more of my vehicles for expressing myself. Like with Chand Tara, I always struggle कि यार नहीं करो एक और टेक यार. And Umran and me, हम लोग का scene ही on इस वजह से हुआ क्योंकि we were both fans of the fact कि यार जैसे ये impulsive जो चीज़ रिकॉर्ड होती है ये होती है. हाँ. तो you know retakes वाला scene ही नहीं है यार. मतलब ऐसा नहीं कि आपने कोई बहुत बुरी चीज़ बजा दी. But उसमें जो एक expression होता है ना.
Yeah, I can relate to that because from going from the precision of the DA method to
you yourself,
the open
exactly.
field of cosmic fluid.
Exactly.
Because I needed to let go of that इतना overthinking और over.
बहुत ज़्यादा हो जाता है. और फराज के साथ भी जब Dusk का भी हमारा I think these are one of the questions that you wanted to ask also.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to fuse them into. फराज के साथ भी जो मेरा our departure, Faraz's departure from Dusk eventually in 2004 or 5.
These are questions that were actually sent in by you guys. So sorry we don't have names alongside, but we're kind of incorporating that.
So basically Faraz ka departure Dusk mein 2004 mein hua, and we'd come back from a European tour, and at that time I think he was also very heavily inclined towards pursuing his own solo career and Mizraab at that time. And by that time I'd had it with playing this very off time sort of, you know. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still listen to tons of Meshuggah every day. Right?
You guys had done a European tour.
हमने कर ली थी चीजें, मुझे अच्छा लगता था, लेकिन I wanted to go back to that whole Motorhead sort of like simple, more like
rock and roll,
like, you know, D beat, like you know, and 3 chords ke heavy riffs, you know. So that's when I believe मेरा और फराज का एक point पे split हुआ. But we've managed to keep in touch, thankfully. But obviously things are different than they were back in the day.
Of course, yeah.
When you're not making music, जब आप म्यूजिक बजा रहे होते हैं साथ में तो बड़ी चीज़ों पे आप कनेक्ट कर रहे होते हैं.
हाँ, it's like a symbiotic relationship.
तो एक तो ये हुआ था, तो उसके बाद we went back into more our doom and more heavy style of playing again and less proggy sort of stuff, even though फिर अब प्रॉगी हो जाता है क्योंकि वो अंदर है कहीं ना कहीं. एक सीधा रिफ है तो उसके ऊपर मुझे दिल चाहता है कि मैं आरपीजियो या कुछ आरपीजिएटर टाइप का इफेक्ट गिटार से बजाऊं, यू नो, व्हिच इज फन. बट आई थिंक इफ आई से टू बी ऑनेस्ट, it's become more organic now.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's the journey that you've been on to as well, because I hear it in your recordings and I was like, man, that warmth, I love that warmth, you know, because वो warmth नहीं है, बीच में से हट गई थी हर चीज के अंदर से. हम लोग ओवर प्रोड्यूस कर देते हैं हर चीज को. चांद तारा ऑर्केस्ट्रा मक्की मदनी, our biggest track to date, is a rebellion to over produced Pakistani music, if I were to put it in simple words. Umran and me wanted to rebel against this overproduced 36 tracks. Makki Madani has 3 tracks. There's a bass with the weird effect.
Yeah.
There's a drums that come on much later, like percussion. Sikandar is playing. Hardly any guitar. And Rizwan's banjo. Yeah. You know, that's it. Yeah. And the sound is huge.
Yeah. The simpler it is, the more space, the bigger it can sound.
Absolutely.
I mean, people have forgot that over time. But I think wo bhi hai ki, you know, you have to be, as an artist, you have to be a consumer of art.
Yes.
And, you know.
And you got to be a listener for music.
Wahi na ke, like, wahi jo aapki story hai from the 80s till now, finding bands, now, you know, you're...
Yeah, being a filmmaker. Yeah. Being a filmmaker, me and a few friends of mine, one of them became a big cinematographer later on, went and DOP'd for 2 feature films. यार हम लोग एक रात में 2 फिल्में देखते थे उस जमाने में. DVD का जमाना था. रात गुजारनी है तो 2 फिल्में देखनी है रात को, चाहे कोई यूरोपियन बी मूवी आपने लगा ली, चाहे कोई आपने क्लासिक कोई MGM की फिल्म देखी पुरानी ब्लैक एंड वाइट. लेकिन नहीं कहा यार, मैं आज भी a lot of my film students, you know, I tell them, dude, unless and until you're a big consumer of the art, you will not find your voice.
Yeah, and it's really about, like, you know, you mentioned at one point that Dream Theater sound, or that Americanized, commercialized metal sound had become stale for you. And it's similar for me, because that's when I got into Opeth.
Exactly.
Right? And these guys were doing something completely different.
And for me, Umair, it was not just the sound, it was the fact that covers had become photoshopped.
Yeah.
Outer glow लगी हुई लोगों के बाहर Photoshop का वो जो cheap वाला effect होता था, मुझे सब चीजों से मसला होना शुरू हो गया था.
Yeah, एक वो everything had become like cookie cutter.
Yeah, you know, very much. And वो जब cookie cutter formula हो जाता है ना, तो वो formula फिर आपको,
then it's no longer art, then you're just replicating something.
Exactly.
Right? Art is to in some way push the boundary.
People always used to say, यार आप जो है वो पाकिस्तान का बैंड है and आपकी म्यूजिक में कुछ ना कुछ इन्फ्लुएंसेस हैं. डस्क की बात होती थी, तो यार why not, you know, get some more elements. And I said now is not the time. And then finally our last album came out, Wajia Naqvi sang on it, Sherry sang on it. Before that एक एल्बम थी, उसमें मेरे एक थिएटर के बहुत सारे पुराने दोस्त थे, उनसे मैंने थिएटर के पीसेस पढ़वाए थे म्यूजिक में, और बीच में वो कोई इन्फ्यूज किए थे हमने. तो हर चीज का टाइम होता है यार. एंड यू नो, यू नीड टू, दुनिया तो गुजरी, आप भी तो साथ साथ मेच्योर हो रहे हैं, आप एक चीज रिपीट नहीं करेंगे ना, बिकॉज फिर एक रेपिटेशन हो जाएगी, फॉर्मूला हो जाएगा.
और 2 प्रोसेस चल रहे हैं ना, एक आपका इंटरनल प्रोसेस जो आप कंज्यूम कर रहे हैं, जो आपको एक्सप्रेशन करनी है, दूसरा आप देख रहे हैं कि सोसाइटी में क्या कंज्यूम हो रहा है.
Absolutely.
And you want to stand out amongst that, you know.
Absolutely.
Which in a way, for being Pakistani metalheads, you know, it was a lot easier to stand out.
Yeah, for sure.
If you go back 20 years.
All the way.
You know,
all the way.
उस वक्त शो करते थे 200 लोग यार.
हाँ बड़े लोग.
नहीं, अब आप शो करो और मतलब 50 लोगों को भी टिकट बेचना is a problem if you're not in the mainstream or in the in kind of music.
यार अभी नहीं किया था हमने the show that you played on when you were part of the live lineup.
Yeah, at
CTO,
PSCC.
PSCC यार वो टिकट नहीं बिक रहे थे. 2,000 रुपए का टिकट था and people were double-minded about buying it.
There were 2 bands.
And there were 2 bands.
Yeah.
And a full night of entertainment, which is like we played all together. We played 3 hours plus, yaar.
Yeah.
That was
a good show.
Sounds of Karachi, Essence Band and us, and then we did. उसके बाद सब चढ़ गए थे स्टेज पे. We did like a jam session, which was great.
Yeah.
उसमें मुझे याद है 2,000 रुपए का टिकट बेचना मुश्किल हो गया था.
By the way, I feel like that's the last show of its kind that I remember at PSCC, and उससे पहले बस हर कुछ महीने वहाँ कुछ होता, उसके बाद कुछ नहीं हुआ.
फिर कोविड भी आ गया ना.
Literally उसके बाद कोविड आया, उसके बाद कुछ हुआ ही नहीं.
2018 या early 19 या late 18 की बात है ये. उसके बाद 19 गुजरा है, 19 के बाद कोविड शुरू. तो आपको पता ही नहीं चला कि हुआ क्या. What hit you? So a lot of things have changed, you know.
Yeah, but I feel like you know, things come in cycles or time आएगा. क्योंकि आजकल, you know, the biggest shows are happening with kids doing vocals over laptops and thousands of people are there loving it. But I feel like at one point people will realize that there's a bigger entertainment factor and experience factor of actual musicians playing.
Absolutely, for sure, man.
So we've started a new portion of these podcasts where we put up a picture of our guests before they come in and we ask the audience for some questions. I think most of them we've covered, but one question reh gaya, which is from Farhan P, which is what's the story behind the burnt Faraz Akbar guitar?
Yeah, tragedy.
This happened at a shoot, apparently.
Shoot.
Yeah.
We did a few videos for Mizraab. The one that I did that became an award-winning video later on, mashallah. वो था इतना, हमने ग्रंजी सा वो कितनी सदियां का शूट किया था वीडियो जाके, वो अलग स्टोरी है. लेकिन उससे पहले वो फराज का एक बड़ा प्रॉगी सा बड़ा uplifting गाना था, इंसान नाम था उस गाने का.
I love that song.
Yeah, it's a great song. And उसका मुझे याद है सेट भी मैंने ही बनाया था. उसका सेट पे पीछे मैंने कोई फ्लैट्स लगे हुए थे, उस पे जाके मैंने इन लोग की तस्वीरें लेके ना, ब्लैक एंड वाइट तस्वीरें लेके, I blown them up on photocopy machines and then I pasted them and I painted over them. वो बड़ा अच्छा वो हो गया था. And Faraz, at the end of that video, मैंने कहा कुछ तो और हो. तो मेरे पास एक पुराना गिटार होता था. That guitar, I don't know उसकी हिस्ट्री क्या थी. वो उसको मैंने किस बॉडी थी वो सिर्फ. I think वो गिटार का नेक था और बेस की बॉडी थी. फ्रैंकेनस्टाइन गिटार था और उस पर आज तक कभी स्ट्रिंग्स नहीं लगी. मैंने 2 दफ़ा उसको बनवाने की कोशिश की थी when back in the day in the 90s, लेकिन वो नहीं हुआ था. वो पड़ा रहता था. It was a shell. मैंने कहा यार वो शेल है, उसको हम टांगेंगे छत से and I'm going to set fire to it. Yeah, like the Hendrix homage, extreme rock metal attitude, ये वाली चीज़, you know. तो वो पूरी शूट हो गई. हम एक छोटे से स्टूडियो में क्लिफ्टन में थे. बड़ा यार ख़तरनाक वाक़या है वैसे. एंड वही लैक ऑफ एक्सपीरियंस, लैक ऑफ गाइडेंस यार. अनफॉर्चुनेटली पेट्रोल मैंने मंगवाया बोतल में. और जब मज़े की बात मैं डाल रहा हूँ, जेमी में गॉड ब्लेस हिज सोल, आई मीन जेमी था उस शूट पे. जेमी ने कहा यार आर यू श्योर, ज़रा ख्याल से वो हो ही उसी में जो है वो डाला. एंड आई वॉज ओवर कॉन्फिडेंट, आई वॉज स्टूपिड. और मैं उसके ऊपर पेट्रोल डाल के हमने आग लगाई तो वो जल पड़ा. जल रहा था गिटार. शॉर्ट मिल गया हमें. अब शॉर्ट मिल गया यार, मैं भी अब मैं उस पर और डालने की मैंने कोशिश की. वो जो डाली तो वो पेट्रोल बोतल में ज़्यादा नहीं था. एंड उसने पकड़ी आग into the bottle को आग लगी. जेमी ने कहा लेट गो ऑफ द बॉटल फेंकी पेट्रोल मेरे हाथ पे. आई स्टिल हैव बर्न मार्क्स बाय द वे फ्रॉम दैट. ऑल ऑफ दिस इज बर्न्ड.
ओह डैम.
ये आज तक जला हुआ है मेरा सारा. और जिंदगी में आप सुनते हैं कि आपको आग लग जाए तो आप उसको कवर करें या उसको ऑक्सीजन से वो करें. द फर्स्ट थिंग दैट आई डिड जब मुझे आग लगी हाथ पे वाज
उसको हवा और दे रहे.
एंड देन आई थिंक हम लोग लॉक हो गए स्टूडियो में. कुछ हुआ, शीशा था. आई पंच थ्रू दैट ग्लास बिकॉज पैनिक हो गए थे हम सारे. आग लग गई, सेट पे आग लग गई. वो ग्लास का दरवाज़ा शीशे विंडो थी, उस पर मैंने पंच मारा, मेरी उंगलियों से खून शुरू हो गया. एनीवे वो आग बुझा ली. लेकिन ड्यूरिंग दैट आग व्हाट हैपेंड वाज फराज बेचारा lost his most precious guitar to date. And this is something that I've said it on record maybe several times, but I want to say it again. I feel horrible about it. तो वो बेचारे का उसका वो गिटार था and it was a very
फ्यूजन नाम
उसका जैक्सन था, बट इट वाज अ डिंकी मॉडल, बट इट वाज वो होता है ना कभी कभी एक ऐसा कोई पीस आता है व्हिच रेजोनेट्स विद यू. अब आप डिंकी मॉडल कोई और भी उठा लें, वो फराज ने कितने डिंकी मॉडल्स उसके बाद यूएस में जाके ट्राई किए, उसको वो वाली मजा नहीं आता था जो उसको उस गिटार से आता था. इट वाज अ ब्लैक कलर जैक्सन जो कि वो जल गया और कुछ चीजें जली, फुटेज नहीं चली, वीडियो बनी उसके बाद, विच वॉज इंटरेस्टिंग, बट इट वॉज अ प्रिटी बैड एक्सपीरियंस. मैं जब सोचता हूँ तो मुझे अच्छा नहीं फीलिंग नहीं आती. बड़ा अल्लाह मियाँ ने बचाया यार. इट कुड हैव बीन फॉर मी, इट कुड हैव बीन फेटल बिकॉज मुझे आग लग गई थी उसमें.
तो
रॉक एंड रोल अल्लाह ने बचाना था, बचा लिया. तो ये सब कुछ होता है जी.
बट हाँ, आई थिंक क्या कहते हैं,
but let's end on a positive note.
Let's end
but
no, what's next for you? Like what's in your, because something's always cooking with Babar Sheikh.
यार अभी honestly speaking थोड़ा सा backtrack किया है in terms of music. I believe चांद तारा पिछले 2-1.5 साल से बिल्कुल एक्टिव नहीं है, बहुत कम. एक सैफ from Sketches, they did a collaborative track with us back in 2020-21. That was the last thing we did. Umran has moved in 2020 and it's really impossible. कोशिश मेरी होती है कि कुछ क्रॉस कोलैबोरेशन करें, लेकिन बड़ा मुश्किल होता है.
Him moving is just a big loss to the scene, I think.
तो it is. Umran single-handedly, Umran ने ख़त्म कराया ये सारा shred scene पाकिस्तान से, मुझे लगता है, which is, I say that with a lot of pride, because he got a different flavor in, you know.
Yeah, and he was just like, for me personally, ever since I had this studio up and running, apart from my own friends that came by, Umran was always here. Like, Umran, supporter of the scene.
Umran जैसे लोग बड़े कम हैं दुनिया में. अल्लाह उसको खुश रखे और हम सबको पॉजिटिव होने की तौफीक दे अल्लाह मियाँ. बिकॉज मुझे लगता है यार हमारे सीन में अभी भी, चाहे म्यूजिक सीन हो, फिल्म सीन हो, I operate in 3 or 4 different scenes. I operate in the music scene, not so much as you guys. I operate in the art scene because I am an installation artist. I practice, I do group shows as an artist. I am an educationist as well. तो मेरा वाला भी सीन है. और जो सबसे ज्यादा एक्टिव सीन है मेरा इज इन द फिल्म सीन. यार हर जगह मुझे लगता है कि हम क्रिटिकली देखते हैं, हम किसी की अच्छी बात को सराह के उसको आगे नहीं लेके आते. मानो यार एक चीज अच्छी की है आपने तो उसको वो करें, आप अपलिफ्ट करें, पॉजिटिविटी बढ़ जाएगी. और चीज हम सिर्फ नेगेटिव देख रहे होते हैं अनफॉर्चुनेटली. और ये अफसोस की बात भी है कि कौम हमारी अनफॉर्चुनेटली हमारे डीएनए के अंदर आ गया नेगेटिव देखना. पॉजिटिव देखना बड़ा छोड़ दिया हमने. इसीलिए कभी कोई पॉजिटिव बात कर रहा होता है तो वो आदमी आपको अच्छा लगता है. आप कहते हैं यार अब तो यू नो पीपल आर पेड टू डू पॉजिटिव टॉकिंग, मोटिवेशनल स्पीकिंग, ऑल ऑफ दैट स्टफ. बट आई हैव नोन पीपल हु आर पॉजिटिव थ्रू एंड थ्रू, यू नो.
And it breeds positivity.
बिल्कुल.
Everything can always be better.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely.
So, but no, it's been lovely having you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this was lovely. It was a jog down memory lane for me. And best of luck to you and Aleph and the podcast. Thank you.
And please, if you're, I'm sure you would have heard of Babar Sheikh, but if you haven't, check out his stuff: Tara Orchestra, Dusk, his work as a filmmaker, his art, and follow the channel. Share your comments below. And
most importantly, this is an excellent podcast that needs to get to more people for sure.
And we can with your help.
Inshallah.
Thank you.
Okay.